Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Climate Smart Planning for MPAs. We're so glad to have you with us as we explore how to intentionally integrate climate change into MPA management planning. My name is Annie Cross, and I am the Resilient Science Lead for the Nature Conservancy Global's Ocean. This webinar is brought to you by the Nature Conservancy's Reef Resilience Network in partnership with the Blue Nature Alliance and in collaboration with the International Coral Reef Initiative as part of their 4 Coral webinar series. Today, we'll talk about the importance of planning under the uncertainty of climate change and the new guidance on climate smart management planning developed by the Reef Resilience Network. We will share insights from the past 20 years of work on integrating climate change into management planning and explain why it's critical for effective conservation. We present some practical lessons from a pilot project in the Bahamas, where managers adapted MPA management plans to better address climate impacts and strengthen both ecosystem and community resilience. We're fortunate to be joined by 2 great speakers today. John Morrison is the Director of Conservation Planning and Measures at WWF US. John is an ecologist and conservation biologist and has worked for WWF for 27 years as a conservation planner, supporting teams around the world. He also helps run the Conservation Coaches Network, training and supporting coaches who use the conservation standards planning framework to help project teams in the field. We're also joined by Elise Sebastian, who's a parks planner at the Bahamas National Trust, where she leads the development of management plans for protected areas across the Bahamas. Her work involves engaging stakeholders, coordinating internal planning, and conducting site visits to ensure effective and inclusive conservation strategies. She also serves as the BNP lead for the Climate Smart Management Planning project that you're about to hear today. I will be joining them to present the Climate Smart framework the Reef Resilience Network developed. So we're looking forward to an insightful presentations, and we hope you'll leave with practical takeaways to integrate climate change and its impact in your own work. The webinar will last for 1 hour, and the presentation will be followed by an open question and answer session. And then a recording of the webinar will be available on the Reef Resilience Network website and YouTube channel, and we'll be emailing you the link as well. So before we start, I'd like to give you a few tips on navigating the Zoom toolbar. On the left, you'll see an audio setting button. Click the up arrow and select for audio options such as speakers or headphones. If you experience any technical difficulties, use the chat feature to send a private message to Paola Felix, who can assist you. You can use the Q&A feature throughout the webinar to type any questions you have for the presenter. And you can also choose to submit your question anonymously. During the Q&A after the 3 presentations, you can use the raise hand feature if you would like to be unmuted to ask your question, or continue to use the Q&A feature. So here's the agenda for today. We're in the welcome and introductions that are going to be 5 minutes. Then John will present on climate smart conservation planning. I'll give a quick tour of the climate smart approach, and Alyssa will talk to you about lessons from the Bahamas. And then we'll have our Q&A and we'll wrap up. So before we dive into the webinar, I'd like to briefly share about the Reef Resilience Network and Blue Nature Alliance. For 20 years, the Nature Conservancy Reef Resilience Network has helped marine managers and practitioners around the world effectively manage, protect, and restore critical marine habitats. 2025 marks the network's 20th anniversary, which we're very excited about. And we want to thank and celebrate you, our network members, for sharing your time, expertise, idea, and of course, for all the hard and important work you do day in and day out to care for the world's coral reef. To learn more about the network and explore a resource for coral reef managers and practitioners, please visit reefresilience.org, where you can also join our 7,000 members around the world. Now for BNA. Our partners, the Blue Nature Alliance, is a global initiative accelerating ocean conservation through partnership with government, NGOs, and local communities. They collaborate with over 90 partners across 161 ocean conservation areas. The Alliance project impacts over 2.2 billion hectares of ocean by protecting new areas and improving the management of existing ones. The Alliance also fosters global conditions to achieve the goal of protecting 30% of the world's ocean by 2030, requiring enhanced human, technical, and institutional capacity. I will now like to welcome John Morrison to tell us more about the importance of climate-smart conservation planning.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So first, I want to say that I don't consider myself an expert in climate change planning, although I've been wrestling with these issues for 15 or 20 years, and I'm not sure if they get any easier, but we're learning as we go. So I'll give you one perspective on climate smart conservation planning, and I'll start out by giving you my own personal definition of what climate smart conservation planning is for MPAs or any other protected or conserved area for that matter. And that definition is that the strategies, I'm still on that first slide, but that's fine. The strategies that you choose to pursue were selected after a thorough analysis of the full range of the potential effects of climate change and their interactions with non-climate threats. This allows you to understand the benefits of choosing either to deal with the non-climate threats or to try to deal with the adaptation to the climate changes. And it will give you a better idea of the risks of your strategies not working. Okay, now I'm ready for the next slide. So my remarks are a reflection of these two extensive guidance documents that were published by GIZ, and they're freely available. I'm sure we can make the links to these available. Next slide. And that guidance was developed in the context of a planning framework, a conservation planning framework known as the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation, or also known as the Conservation Standards, which is a widely used framework for conservation planning, implementation, and evaluation of conservation projects. Next slide. So, what are the key questions for planners? The first question is hopefully obvious. What are the most consequential impacts that we expect from climate change? Next, how do those climate change impacts interact with the conventional or non-climate threats? And then finally, what combination of solutions might best address the combined impacts? Next slide. As a reminder, we're dealing with quite a bit of uncertainty. At base, the first element of uncertainty is how much greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 equivalent will be emitted by humanity as a whole across the planet. The next is questions about which general circulation models are most accurate, which are giving us the best picture of what the future might look like. Next, the magnitude of change is an issue for most places, and in some places, even the trend direction is unknown. There are some places around the world where it's not clear if it's going to get wetter or drier. And then on top of that, we're not sure about how much it's going to change. Next is stochasticity, or just general randomness in the system. Next is the responses of nature to these changes. Yes, in general, organisms will tend to move away from the equator towards the poles. They'll move higher in elevation as the climate warms, but those changes are not even across the planet. And there are a lot of subtleties involved in trying to understand how ecosystems and species will respond to these changes. And then understanding human responses. So all of these things add up to a very unstable layer cake that we need to be able to deal with. Next slide. This slide will give you a short overview, and if you don't want to read those extensive guidance documents, this slide should cover everything, I hope. But first is to deconstruct climate change. For years, in the models we built, we had one box that said climate change. And since then, we've learned that we really need to deconstruct the elements. We need to understand changes in temperature on an average basis, on a seasonal basis. We need to understand how precipitation is going to be changing and all sorts of other things. We need to break climate change down so it's not this monolithic problem. We've learned that. Next is to understand how those changes should impact nature. As I said, in general, organisms will move away from the equator and up in elevation, but there's a lot more subtleties that we need to try to understand. Next. And the next one as well. As far as humans go, we really need to understand how the impacts of climate change will affect people. Even if it's a strict conservation project, if we don't understand what's going to happen to people, then we won't understand the next thing, which is understanding how people are likely to react. So we want to try to predict people's reactions so that we can try to avoid maladaptation. So not only do we need to understand how people will react, but we need to understand how those reactions will impact nature so that we can somehow try to avoid maladaptation, which may be worse than the actual climate changes themselves. And finally, we want to try to use scenarios to explore uncertainty. The idea is to try to bound the problem, try to understand the extremes of the problem so that we can identify strategies that will hopefully work no matter what happens with climate change. So that's how scenarios can help us by exploring the potential for change in all directions so that will help us try to ground truth our strategies that will work no matter what happens. All right, next slide. In terms of the level of effort that we put out, this slide summarizes some of the options. Now, the first option may actually be appropriate for some types of conservation projects. If they're very short term, or if they're perhaps a high level policy project, then they might not need to put a lot of effort into addressing climate change. However, this is not an option for any kind of a long-term place-based effort. You really can't ignore climate change. So the next option is to work with existing climate trends and assume that those trends are going to continue and not do any further analysis. And there are many conservation projects around the world that are doing just this. They see where things seem to be going and they're working with those trends. The next option is to do some modeling and choose at least one future projection scenario and work with that. Then finally, you could have 2 or more future scenarios. This multiplies the amount of work that you need to do, but it gives you a lot more confidence that the strategies that you do select are going to work no matter what happens with climate. Next slide. Okay, so over the course of the next couple of slides, I'm going to present a situation diagram, and that's what this is, and I'll explain what these boxes are. You can see in the middle, we've got some riparian forest, some tugai forest from Central Asia. That's the ecosystem, focal ecosystem in this example that provides forest pastures to support agricultural livelihoods as you move to the right. And then on the left-hand side, you can see some threats and the impacts of those threats to that riparian forest. So the first non-climate threat is the operation of upstream hydropower dams, which is causing a drop in the groundwater table. In addition to that, you've got upstream water withdrawal, which is also contributing to that drop in the groundwater table. And then you've got overgrazing by domestic livestock in the forest reserve, which is causing a reduction in the natural forest regeneration. So we've got the non-climate threats in the pink boxes and the impacts of those climate threats in the brown boxes. negatively impacting the riparian forest. So this is again, an excerpt from a situation diagram. Now, if we go to the next slide and we add in the climate change threats, you can see how those climate change threats are interacting or exacerbating existing problems. So up on top, we've got less precipitation in the upper catchment coming from climate change, which is also contributing to that drop in the groundwater table. And then bottom left, we've got more frequent and local heat and drought, which is contributing to the tree die-offs from heat and desiccation stress, which is not helping the reduction of natural forest regeneration. It's also causing people to withdraw even more water from the system. So this is the general idea of the kind of analysis we're looking for. We're trying to put together the climate threats along with the non-climate threats to try to have the big picture and to be able to choose our strategies accordingly. So the next step would be to add in strategies onto this diagram, try to find the intervention points. Next slide. And this is my last slide. This is a categorization of climate smart strategies. So I think if you click Pala, it'll start on the threat abatement. Yeah. So this is the first grouping of climate smart strategies. This is reducing non-climate threats. This is not, strictly speaking, adaptation, but if you've done a thorough analysis of what all of the possible impacts of the climate and non-climate threats are, this may be the most adaptive strategy that you could choose in particular situations. Again, it's not adaptation, but I would say that this is adaptive and climate smart if you have done that thorough analysis. The next group is viability enhancement. So this is typically restoration. It could be planting trees, it could be moving animals around. The idea is that you're working directly with an ecosystem or a species. You're not dealing with the threats. You're directly trying to build the resilience of an ecosystem or species. This is also not adaptation, but in certain circumstances, this is adaptive. Next is a category of climate adaptation. So an example of that is creating artificial habitats or conditions for biodiversity. That is adaptation. You're doing something that you wouldn't normally have done. And then finally, we've got 3B, another form of adaptation where you're trying to prevent human maladaptation. So I hope you see how I'm trying to distinguish between adaptation and things that are adaptive. If you've done a thorough analysis of what climate change is, you understand how it interacts with the non-climate threats, and you're trying to be strategic. Okay, those are my introductory comments, and Nick, back to you.
Thanks so much, John, for this great intro on which I'm going to build on quite a lot, actually. So I'm going to talk about the framework that the Reef Resilience Network has developed for MPAs in the Bahamas and in more general climate smart planning guidance. Next. To give you a little bit of background about the project, in 2023, the Bahamas National Trust expressed an interest in building capacity to incorporate climate change into existing and new management plan. And so the Reef Resilience Network and the Nature Conservancy Northern Caribbean program worked together to develop a framework and then test it through a series of workshops. And this is what I'm going to present today. Next. The first thing that we did is that we went to look for what type of guidance already existed. And we came across a lot of great material. And we selected these five key pieces of literature to really support and help us guide how we were going to create the framework. And I just wanted to mention that the first one there is the one that John co-authored and mentioned earlier on. Next. So we wanted to create a framework around a tool that managers were already using to create their management plan. And so we went back to that cycle of management planning with the different steps. So we looked at where we thought we should intentionally bring in climate change that would make an impact. And we selected 3 areas. The first one is in the assess step for managers, where they define, review the scope vision, decide what they want to protect, and look at the threats that are impacting these things they want to protect. The other place we looked at were during the planning step, where managers usually develop and review the strategies that they need to develop to address threats and reach their goals. And finally, the third area was in the analyze and adapt, of course, to make sure that there is going to be clear adaptive management around strategies for climate change. Next. So we came up with this framework, and you see it split by color. And so the first grouping is really about thinking about how do you bring in the idea of the concept of climate change into your planning. And that's first by bringing in climate data. When managers are gathering the data to understand what's the context for their MPAs, they want to bring in climate data. The second grouping that we have is the step where managers are looking at what they want to protect, looking at the threats that are impacting these things they want to protect, and of course, bringing in the threat of climate change. The third grouping is through planning, where we are bringing tools to help managers define climate smart goals and objectives, but mostly to start thinking about what are the strategies and action they can have to address these climate change threats. Finally, as I mentioned, we wanted to include tools for developing, monitoring, and evaluation to create adaptive management. And because this framework was created to review existing MPA plans, we have a final step that helps managers review the whole of the management plan to see if there's anywhere else where climate change should be integrated intentionally. Next. To run through this framework, based on what we did in the Bahamas, you could do it through 2 workshops, a first workshop of 2 days, where you're really bringing into, where managers are really thinking about what are the climate data that they have and how that's going to impact their MPAs. And then the second workshop of 4 days to run through the framework. However, this framework can be done any way people want. It can be done through a whole year if you want to bring in more stakeholders. And so there's a lot of different ways to approach this. So the one thing I'm going to say is in most cases, you'll want to bring in a facilitator that's familiar with climate smart planning. Next. So I'd like to quickly go through 4 key areas where examples of 4 key areas where we wanted to intentionally include climate change. Next. So this first one, as I had mentioned, is gathering climate data. What you want to try and understand is, for example, how much will sea level rise in 10, 50, 100 years? So where do you find this kind of data? There's global data sets. So they're all based on models that are going to give you projection of climate data. There's global models, there's regional models, and there's very few local models. So for example, for the Bahamas, we had to use data for Caribbean-wide projection. How precise does the data have to be? Well, it would be great to know, for example, how much your sea level rise is going to rise and how quickly, right? But sometimes all you are going to be able to get are trends, and that's usually enough to get started to understand what types of scenarios is what are your MPAs, what type of climate change scenarios to look at for your MPAs. Next. The other example I'd like to give is once you have an understanding of this climate projections, you want to try and understand what impacts climate change threats have on what you're trying to protect. And so as Jen mentioned, we are no longer just talking about climate change threats, but we're splitting it up. And typically for MPAs, you're going to be thinking about sea level rise, increased sea surface temperature, changes in extreme events, and even ocean acidification. And so you want to understand what are the impacts of these threats on your conservation features and what you're trying to protect in 20, 50, 100 years. You also want to try and understand how your climate change threats are going to exacerbate non-climate change threats. So for example, low water quality will be exacerbated by increasing sea surface temperature, by accelerating bleaching and preventing coral reef recovery. And who has this knowledge? Well, MPA managers might have this knowledge, or often experts that are helping you with your monitoring, scientists that might help you with your monitoring may have some of this knowledge, or a simple literature review may help you start understanding what will happen and project. Next. This is something that we brought in and that the Bahamas team really appreciated. Alyssa is going to talk to you about it. Once you understand what impacts you're going to have, climate change is going to have on what you're trying to protect, you really want to think about, and you know that these threats are not going to stop, you really want to start thinking about what level, what is an acceptable level of change in a system. And that's really going to depend on how much resource do you have to put in protecting something, what is acceptable by your stakeholders, etc. Next. And so one of the frameworks that we borrowed from here is this resist, accept, direct, or RAD framework. The RAD framework lays out three approaches. The first one is resist, where managers are going to try to resist the changes brought by climate change threats. For example, they will try to restore ecosystem composition to historical or acceptable conditions. The other one is accept. You're going to accept the changes that climate change is going to bring to what you're trying to protect. And maybe the only thing you're going to do is manage expectations from your stakeholders. Finally, direct, where managers will they'll know there's going to be a change, but they'll try to lead that change to a condition that's acceptable. Next. And so often this is done, RAD is staged, where, for example, for the Bahamas, they knew that there wasn't going to be a lot of impact on their seagrass at the beginning, so they were just going to accept a small change until the certain threshold where they might switch to a different strategy to direct the changes. And the key thing here is you want to make sure that your management approaches are reflected in your climate smart goals. So where do you want your seagrass to be in 20, 50, 100 years time is going to be dictated by that management approach that you've chosen. Next. Finally, the Holy Grail. We provide in the framework, we're providing information on what could be some of the climate smart strategies that managers can adopt. The key one is reduce your non-climate smart stressors. To reduce your non-climate stressors, to make sure you're looking at what are the threats outside of your MPA boundary, and not to forget to manage for social resilience, so that, like John mentioned, you don't have a behavior that's going to exacerbate the threats you already have. And that is it. I'm going to pass it now to Alyssa. Thank you.
Thank you, Anik, and hello again, everyone. So we're going to jump right into it. So I'm going to be speaking about some of the lessons we took from the project that we had in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy's Reef and Resilience Network in updating a few of our management plans to include climate smart practices and management strategies. So you can go to the next slide. So the reality of climate smart management planning. So when we went into this, we, as an organization, when we always talked about climate change in our management plans, it was always in a way where we stated it like climate change is too big of an issue for us to tackle at our scale. So we're not going to get into that when we talk about how we're going to manage certain protected areas. So what I would say to those who have not started planning with climate change in mind, it's always a good time to start now. With data gaps, you will likely never have all of the information that you need. And if you wait until you do have that, or you feel like you have that, you probably still won't even have everything. So with the data gaps, just move forward. In a lot of our cases, we did not have certain baselines for things that we want to protect and that we want to create strategies for, but we still move forward with creating goals and objectives around those things. So there will be data gaps. There'll also be hard conversations about key conservation features. So a lot of the time, as conservationists, as protected area managers, we want to conserve everything, and that's just not our reality. And sometimes we have to be grounded and brought back down to earth to realize that we can't conserve it all, we can't protect it all, and at some point it's going to be, for lack of a better word, you're going to be wasting resources putting it into something when you could be directing those resources into something else. And then there's all these hard conversations also affect resources of economic, cultural, historic, or religious importance. A lot of people in the areas that are affected by climate change, they do have some kind of history to the area, whether it be that they grew up fishing there in the past, maybe they used to go there on beach days all the time with certain loved ones that are no longer there. It's tied to something religious for them. So climate change affects all of these aspects, and those hard conversations do reach into different pockets of things that sometimes bring out certain emotions out of people. So when you're going through this process, you have to have this in mind and be ready to have these hard conversations with different groups of people and also inside your organization as well. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so some of the climate impacts seen in the Bahamas. So we're seeing, we've been experiencing an increase in sea surface temperatures, sea level rise. We are also seeing an increase in the frequency of category 4 and 5 hurricanes. So one that we always talk about because it's fairly recent, even though it was 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, almost 6 years ago now, but it's still in everyone's mind. And it kind of brought climate change to the forefront for our community. In the past, we had kind of like a lax approach when it came to hurricane preparedness. But when Hurricane Dorian hit in 2019, it kind of made us like look at it in a different way, like this is real, this is affecting people. So Hurricane Dorian, for those that may not know, was a category 5 storm. It made landfall in Grand Bahama and Abaco. Those are some islands in the north of the Bahamas. So when it made landfall, it was at 185 miles per hour when it made landfall. And when it did make landfall, it seemed to stall over those islands. So it was there for approximately 3 days. So some of the things we experienced outside of obviously great environmental loss, you experience death. We still have people that are missing and not accounted for. So it really played a toll on those communities. So just getting into some of the environmental impacts that I mentioned earlier. So we saw significant damage to mangroves on both of those islands. There was also a significant damage to pine forests, especially in Grand Bahama, with about 77% of the total pine forest on that island. They're now standing dead pines. If you were to visit and you would drive, it's just a lot of standing dead pines. In one of our protected areas, the dune ecosystem that we had, that had this amazing dune on the beach, that was completely wiped away. There was a breach, there was water coming in from the ocean into areas where it never had been before. So those are just some of the impacts that we're seeing here. And obviously with projections, it's predicted to, continue in that way. You can go to the next. So some of the highlights for the process for us obviously was being introduced into something that was really new for us and incorporating this into our planning. But something that really stood out to me as a planner was the RAD approach that Annie talked about earlier. So it's resist, accept, direct approach. And with this tool, we were able to really see where we were going to direct our resources and how we were going to shape our goal. Because, like I said, as managers, we're always like, yes, we're going to protect that. We're going to do that. We're going to do that. We're going to do that. And if you put that in your plan 10 years from now, when you go out to the plan to see if you were successful or to track some kind of progress, you sometimes realize you made no progress because you were not actually dedicating resources to these things anyway. So, when we looked at this approach, we focused on each conservation feature that we had ranked earlier in the process. And we had a conversation around, are we going to accept a change in this? Okay. And if that's the case, then we wrote a goal around that. Are we going to resist? And if we are, what is that resisting going to look like? What kind of actions are going to come out of that? And if we're directing, if we're saying that we're directing, because that's, pushing your ecosystem in a preferred state where it might not be feasible to resist, how is that going to look? How are we going to assist with any kind of transition? Do we have funding for that? So this is something that really grounded us, and it helped us shape our goals and objective, and it really made us realize that we have to be super realistic when we are planning. Of course, we want to be optimistic, but being realistic with the realities and the truths that we live in today, that helped us do that. We can go to the next. So some project challenges. So something that we had a challenge with was updating a management plan that was almost 20 years old. So the general management plan for the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, that was done in 2006. So it was really, really difficult picking up that dated plan and trying to revise those goals and objectives. Obviously, navigating a pilot project, this is not something we've done before, so it was really new to us. So it was kind of tough, and we had to work through that with the team. Sometimes we had to go back and talk about different things, have different meetings. So obviously that was a challenge for us. Creating a process specifically for updating a management plan versus creating a new management plan. So there are materials out there and supplements out there that guide you on how to create a climate smart management plan. This was different for us because we were trying to do updates. So that made us have to think about things a lot differently versus creating a new management plan. Next. So project successes and output. So obviously success and a great output is that we have 3 management plans updated now, and they include climate smart goals and objectives. 17 BNT staff were trained in the climate smart management planning process. And then we also had an introductory workshop to the climate smart process for some of our partner agencies and other protected area managers. And that was across 6 different agencies with 15 to 16 people being trained in those techniques. Next. So I just wanted to put in here an example of some old goals and objectives we have, and then a new climate smart goal and objective. This came out of our Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park management plan that I was talking about earlier that was created in 2006. So if you look at the old goals and objectives, when you read them, you'll see okay, they're a little bit vague. Sometimes you may read them and be like, what does that even mean? So we had to go through that, and we had to create a new goal and objectives to go with that goal that it was more specific, and it also made us actually think about, are we managing certain things? So in one of the things, we're like, protect rare, endemic, threatened, and endangered flora and fauna. Are we doing that though? Are we putting resources and efforts into protecting all of the rare and endemic, threatened, or endangered flora and fauna? Or are we targeting specific ones? So when we thought about it, we actually realized, no, we're actually targeting specific ones in our protected area. And that made us, it helped us come to a conclusion to have an objective strictly around the central Bahamian rock iguana and to establish a baseline for that. So just looking at that, you guys can kind of see how we were able to go through the old ones and make new climate smart goals and objectives for that park, and something that's a lot more realistic for us and a little bit more tangible for us, and something that we're more likely to achieve. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. It's so rare to have with us somebody who's actually putting the framework into action with some tangible results. That it was great hearing from you. We're at the part where we're doing questions and answers. And so I invite Alyssa and John to turn on their camera. And I believe Diana is going to lead us through a series of questions. So just a reminder, don't hesitate to either put in chat or in the Q&A your questions or to raise your hand.
Thanks, Anik, and thank you, Anik, John, and Alyssa, for all of your really great presentations, and just echoing Anik's guidance to everybody, all the participants, to don't hesitate to add your questions to either chat or the Q&A. But I want to start with a question that came in via chat, thinking about all of the monitoring that's often going on in MPAs to monitor MPAs overall, and thinking too about the advancements in monitoring due to new technology, and wanted to see if any of you had thoughts on, how monitoring can support climate smart MPA planning, and kind of what the role of monitoring is in that process.
I can start a little bit, and John, I know you've been thinking about this as well, but I think monitoring for the sake of monitoring is always could be a big waste. However, monitoring that is targeted at your goals and your objectives, and understanding how the strategies that you're putting in place are having an impact on either on threat abatement or building resilience and your and what you're trying to protect is what's needed. And so I think new technology that allows to understand better how some of the strategies you're putting in place to build resilience to climate change, for example, how that is impacting what you're trying to protect. I think that's always a great tool, as long as the data goes back to the managers in a way that those managers are going to be able to use the information. And I don't know if you have anything else to add, John?
I'll just add that because there is so much uncertainty having to do with climate change, it makes monitoring all the more important. And thus, if you have targeted, as Anik says, targeted monitoring, you may need to be monitoring climate change itself, right? Because if you have only a Caribbean-wide model for the Bahamas, for example, you might need to actually have monitoring of the climate itself to understand what's going on in your specific geography. In addition, sometimes climate change is causing a chain of impacts. And sometimes, well, we always try to understand what that chain of impacts is, but we don't always get it right. And so sometimes some targeted monitoring to try to nail down how those impacts are actually cascading can be important. Over.
And Alyssa, did you want to mention the monitoring and evaluation program that you guys created at the same time as the climate smart planning?
Yeah, so when the question came in, I really thought about that. So we recently had enlisted the help of a consultant to create a monitoring and reporting program for us. So it was the first of its kind that we've had at the organization. And it really took into account those key indicators that you need when you are monitoring. Sometimes there's a lot of indicators out there and you kind of get, muddied in the water with everything going on, but we wanted to focus on those key indicators. And it was also great that we were going through this climate smart management planning process at the same time, because that consultant was able to sit in on the process and use those sessions to help him build out the program. So he really used a lot of what was brought up in these sessions and helping us build out that monitoring and reporting tool. So we're going to be using that to give us quick spreadsheets, quick reports on what is going on in the environment. And it's going to help us track our success with our management plan. It's going to help us with our indicators of progress, because what's the point of having goals and objectives if you're not monitoring how well you are achieving them, or even if they need to still be there. So that's something that we were looking into and that we're actually starting to achieve and that we're going to be implementing really in the near future.
Following up on that and just the monitoring theme in general, another question came up via chat about thinking about monitoring and the importance of monitoring to all of this. If any of the speakers have suggestions or thoughts on how that can work when you're talking about MPAs that are further away and farther offshore.
I'm definitely not an expert on offshore MPAs, and I actually don't know many of the tools that are used. I know that for enforcement, some people use satellite monitoring, but that's more or less my extent of knowledge. So maybe John or Alyssa know more about this.
No, you're definitely at the limits of my understanding. I don't have any suggestions.
We're
Yeah.
definitely close to shore people.
Yeah, I can't specifically say for like offshores, but I know in the Bahamas, a lot of our MPAs are spread out over different islands that we do have to access by catching a flight that could range from like 12 to 50 minutes, depending on which island you're going to. So monitoring is expensive. That is like the reality of it, especially for us in an archipelago. So we do use drones. We do send people out there to do surveys, but it's just a lot of resources that do go into monitoring. And I think that also plays into how often we're able to go out and do it, because it does cost a pretty penny.
Great, thanks. And I see a few suggestions from other regions have come in over chat. So things to think about. I mean, I think thinking about the money involved, the scale of NPAs, another question that's kind of related that came in on the chat is thinking about advice for building climate smart management plans over the regional scale. So dealing potentially with transboundary MPAs, transnational objectives, diplomatic issues. How can people address that when they're thinking at a larger scale for some of those MPAs?
I'll take a swipe at that. I think it really just depends on your mandate. If you have a regional mandate, then you can certainly develop a climate smart plan for a region. And the answers you get asking those questions at a regional scale will be different than if you have a finer scale geography. So it's perfectly fine and perfectly workable to work at the regional scale. You'll just come up with different strategies. For example, as you say in your question, you may need to be dealing with diplomatic issues at the larger regional scale, whereas if you're working at a site-specific scale, then you're probably not going to be dealing with those kinds of questions. It really depends on what your mandate is.
John, would you almost say that the bigger the air, like the wider wider area you're looking at, probably the more you're likely to be successful, because climate change impacts such broad areas that sometimes there's issues with species moving or threats? Or do you think that
To a point, I think that often if you're working at a very specific site scale, you find yourself wondering what's going on further afield and realizing that your organisms are moving further away than your original scope. And at the same time, if you're dealing with a really large scope, that it gets more complicated because the effects of climate are different on different ecosystems, et cetera. So it's a balance.
Another question that came in through the Q&A, which is a good one based on everything that's been discussed today, is if folks find that there's a need to update management plans more with the changing climate, and accounting for the climate changes that people are seeing on the ground.
I would say at least you need to be ready to change your plans more frequently. So you need to go into it being flexible. You may or may not end up changing, but you need to make sure you're reviewing your plan on at least an annual basis and be ready to change.
Alyssa, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
So for us, our management plans, they span a 10-year period, but thinking about updates and if climate change is pushing us into a space where we need to update our plans more frequently, I think that also plays into the uncertainty of everything that's going on. So it's an uncertain topic. There will always, like I said earlier, there will always be data gaps. I think, like John said, having the ability to kind of make changes if necessary, I think that's important. But I also think with this conversation, it's important when you go through your review of your management plan after the period of like the life of the plan, you're able to look at it and be like, is this still relevant? Is this still something we need to be putting resources towards? Because in that 10-year span, things could have shifted in a different way where you kind of abandon those management actions that you thought were relevant at the beginning of that 10-year period. And in the middle of that, you pivoted and you started doing something else. So it's kind of having both the ability to be able to, change course and do different things. And also at the end, you have to sit down and you have to review your plan and you have to obviously update it with what's currently going on at the moment because things change all the time. A hurricane could hit like day after tomorrow. So things are always going to be changing. You just have to be adaptive in that process.
And Alyssa, I believe at the Bahamas National Trust, you have a management plan that's pretty, as you said, it's every 10 years, but within that, you have your work plan that you review every year, right? And so that's where it creates that flexibility of what you can do.
Mhm.
Another question that came in via chat was wondering about thinking about the importance of engaging communities and what are some strategies to engage local communities for thinking about how the initiative was working and how the MPA or how the climate smart MPA plan is doing, and using that community engagement both to build the plan but then also potentially manage it adaptively.
So I guess I can speak to that. So when you are involving your communities in your management planning process or even in monitoring and reporting, it has to be a level of trust that is built from the onset. If you don't get that buy-in at the beginning and you don't do the appropriate work at the beginning, it's really going to be hard to go through the process and build that trust. That's something that we've like gone through ourselves, that we see that it's harder to try to build trust after the fact. It's better to get it like at the beginning of your project to bring in those communities. So something that we did do is during our process for climate smart management planning, we invited members of our park advisory committees. So these committees represents little groups in the communities. It could be your taxi drivers, it could be your tour guides, it can be your dive shops. Someone sits on the advisory committee and that person represents the voice of their people. And we had those individuals come to our different sessions in the planning process and they were able to give us feedback. They were able to tell us what they think should be going on with some of these key conservation features and some of the things that they brought to the table we probably were not thinking about necessarily because we might have been thinking more environmental, but they're thinking socioeconomic. So it's important to put that to establish that relationship, build that trust. And it's also important to look into the possibility of having locally led climate adaptation programs. So not where you go into the community and tell them what to do. You go into the community and have them tell you what they want to see and you just assist in building off of that. So sometimes it's better that way and you get more of a turnout when you're not the person going in there and like, I need this, I need that. No, what do you guys need? What do you see? You live here. So you're better able to inform us of what is going on a day-to-day versus us who are managers that might live on a different island. So I think it's important to set that trust in the beginning, and it's also important to shift power into hands of the community members as well.
Thanks, Alyssa. Anik or John, anything you want to add to that about community engagement? So looking at the chat again, some other questions that have come in. Obviously, we're in a changing world in terms of data and information that we can use to inform development of climate smart management and MPA management plans. And so somebody brought up the possibility of using an AI agent as an environmental monitoring tool to think about some of those key climate threats and strategies, and perhaps provide a structured way of thinking about integration of that into a management plan, and was wondering if anybody, particularly John or Anik or Alyssa, have any thoughts on how some of these new tech tools could be harnessed.
Yeah, so I think new technology could play a huge role in better monitoring the environment. But I want to say it out loud that a lot of the benefits of a lot of what is going to be beneficial for your MPA is actually going through this process of getting people together, your managers together, and going through the process of thinking about how climate change is going to impact what you're trying to protect. The understanding if your strategies are working, etc. Yes, that's where probably AI can support, but there's going to be a human at the end of that who's going to take all the information, including reactions from your stakeholders, from the community that's living with these impacts, and make these decisions around that. So that monitoring your ecosystem is such a small part of decision making, moving forward, adapting your work, that it is valuable, but we shouldn't forget that it's just one part of this huge mechanism that managers are responsible for. And a lot of that is human interactions, human reactions to these changes. And I don't think AI can necessarily help with that. So yes, I think it plays a huge role, but I think managers are really, you know, connected to humans, and human behavior is going to be an even more important role.
I think, Anik, building on the importance of humans in this, I think time for one or two last questions, but one that came in over chat is thinking about, Alyssa, building on what you were talking about, engaging the community, is how do you address local communities that, might have different perspectives on resource utilization in the marine environment and may have different ideas about what's important for management? And so how do you get them, on board with the need for management and including climate smart management planning in those management strategies? What are some strategies to kind of talk to people with different perspectives?
So firstly, I think when you are addressing local communities, you have to do a stakeholder analysis or evaluation before you go in, and that kind of prepares you, and you have in your mind the different interests that people will have based on your analysis. So when you go into those communities, you know that people have different perspectives, and almost all of the time, people are going to have different perspectives on different things. People have different wants, people have different needs. I think that's just a reality of it. I think the important thing is bringing those people together and having someone there who is a really good facilitator, who is known to kind of mellow out arguments, make people's voices heard, kind of let them know that what they're saying is valid, but also not over promising to everyone, because at the end of the day, as managers, you still have your goal for your organization, and that's obviously to conserve and protect. While you might take into consideration what people want and what people need, at the end of the day, you do have to be realistic with people and not overpromise and be like, yes, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And that's something that we had in our plans in the past. So one of the goals was talking about the park is there to sustain the regional economy and this and that and this and that. And when we sat down and we looked at it, we realized it was actually not put in place to sustain the regional economy. It was put in place to protect an area that we know is, a hot spot for fish breeding and fish biomass and stuff like that. But a spillover from that is the fact that it helps with economic development. It helps with people, having jobs and stuff like that. So I think when you do deliver things, you have to be realistic and not overpromise and be like, yes, we are going to do that. And you also have to have those people in a space where they can share and they too are able to give insight into your climate smart management planning process, because different people are going to offer different views, and that's going to help you, decide which approach you're going towards, and it's going to help you shape your goals and objectives and strategies. But I feel like that is a part of the process, and there's no cut and dry way to deal with people with differing opinions. It's just that you have to come to some kind of common ground whilst meeting the goals that you want to meet as an organization, and just be sure to include them in the process despite them having different goals and objectives and different needs or different wants.
Thanks, Alyssa. Back to Anik.
Thanks, everybody. I'd like to give a big thanks to Alyssa and John. We're just going to do one last slide to close this webinar because we're at time. So thanks so much for all your great questions. Thanks to both of the speakers. They were fantastic. And I just want to remind you to get more information about the Reef Resilience Network or to become a member to receive our emails, a follow-up on this webinar, information about webinars to come or other material you create, please visit us on reefresilience.org. And we really appreciate your participation and hope to see you on a future webinar. Thanks, everybody.